Hello everyone. In this episode we're going to examine the measurement of absolute income poverty. We're going to start in a way that's really analogous to how we proceeded to find good measures of inequality, namely an axiomatic approach, in which we're going to start with some basic properties that we would want to see in any poverty measure in this case. And the four that we're going to look at are universally basically agreed to be essential to have a good poverty measure among those who've examined this closely. I'll get to those in a moment. Underlying this is, if you want, a kind of meta property. This one was put forth first by Amartya Sen. He called it the focus principle. And the idea here is that any good poverty measure is going to be based only on the incomes, well, being more generally, but incomes of the poor and not of the non-poor. This does a couple of things immediately. First, it tells us that this is a fundamentally different kind of study than inequality. Inequality looks at the population as a whole, but poverty focuses only on those who are below a poverty line. And the other point then is that poverty lines and their establishment is very important in any analysis of income poverty. The four main properties are the following. First, anonymity. You wouldn't want your measure of poverty to be based on anything in particular about those who were poor or were not poor. This is exactly analogous to the way we talked about anonymity as a property for inequality measures. Also directly analogous is the population independence idea or population principle. Just to illustrate, you wouldn't want us to have a measure of poverty that showed China to be poorer than Vietnam just because there happened to be more people in China, or more poor people for that matter. The other two of these four is quite important. These, notice, are different from any of the properties that we looked at when we studied inequality. The first is called monotonicity. We're going to talk about a sensible form of this called strong monotonicity. The idea here is that everything else constant, no one else's income changed, anytime that extra income goes to a poor person, that is to say someone who is below the poverty line, in any amount, extra income for that poor person, then our measure of poverty in the economy has to fall as a result. That does seem like a no-brainer, but we're going to find out that the most commonly used measure of poverty in even policy circles and certainly in the press, the fraction who are poor, does not satisfy even monotonicity. The last is distributional sensitivity. To remember this, you can consider that it has to do with inequality among those who are poor. But here the idea is that any time that money is taken from someone who is poorer and given to someone who is richer, that might just mean less poor, they could still be poor, then as a result, poverty had to rise. Take money from someone who's poorer, give it to someone less poor, they could still be below the poverty line. We have to have a measure that shows poverty worsened in that respect. There's lots of ways to think about that. One simple way is just to return to the idea of diminishing marginal utility. That an extra penny, let's say, is worth more to someone who is starting at 50 cents a day than to someone who is starting at 90 cents a day. And so that is a very good way of thinking about the importance of thinking about inequality among the poor. With this in mind, it turns out, as you'll see in the textbook, that P2 is a particular measure that happens to have all of these properties. And so I'm going to turn attention first to talking about P2 so you get an idea of where it comes from and what its parts are. And I think that's a valuable way to proceed as we look through some of the other ways that poverty is measured. So in this regard, we are going to start with a poverty line. I'm going to call it Y sub P. Some people call it Z, it's very common, but we have so many different variables to keep track of that I like to use YP because it bears in mind that we're talking about income. We're always using Y for income. So this is the poverty line level of income. Now, that's our focus. We start by looking at any one individual whose income is below the poverty line. We're going to see how far below the poverty line they are. So as a result, we start with any person, we'll index them as Y, as I. Any person, I will consider their income below the poverty line, and then this is telling us the gap between the poverty line and their actual income. Now there's many different kinds of poverty lines, so that, for example, we might differ in the year of dollar value. In general, we want to think about this in a normalized way. How poor are people in relation to the underlying poverty line? And so this is the way that it is proceeded to divide by the poverty line. Before thinking about poverty as $1 per day and how far below $1, for example, that person with 90 cents was compared to that person of 50 cents, well, it didn't really matter because if the poverty line is 1, dividing by 1 is not going to change anything. But you can think about that as a way of remembering this overall framework. We start with the poverty line, we divide the income of any one person who's poor I, and after we subtract the amount of income of any one person who is poor from the poverty line, we divide by the poverty line income, such as $1 a day or $1.90 a day, which is the current international extreme poverty line. This is just a starting point. But with P2, we square this gap so that ultimately when we're done, we'll have something that is often called the squared poverty gap. And so here we're trying to get at the idea that it matters how far below the poverty line is, that we're giving greater emphasis the further below the poverty line you get. And that increased emphasis is reflected in the fact that we're squaring. And using the square is a way of representing this difference, in which an extra penny for someone who is making 50 cents a day is worth more than an extra penny for someone who's making 90 cents. If the poverty line is a 1, then if you do the math, you'll find that the extra penny is worth 5 times as much to the person at 50 cents than the person at 90 cents. So that this is one person, person I. But we have to consider poverty in the economy as a whole. So we consider all those people whose income is below the poverty line, YP. And we sum up this squared gap for the individuals. We sum them up over all people, H. So H just means the head count of the poor. That's where this symbol of H comes from. So that if there are 50 million poor people in China, we're summing this over all 50 million people, having done this computation. So we've addressed many of the things we want to see in a poverty measure. Clearly there's anonymity, there's nowhere to put in here who the people are or anything about them other than their income. And we know that monotonicity is being addressed because of the fact that we're taking into account the difference between the poverty line and the actual income of the person. So that if that actual income of this person, everyone else's income the same, were to rise, then this gap falls, and as a result, we're getting a smaller amount captured. And again, the fact that we're squaring is putting greater weight on loss of income, failure to have income, deprivation of income at a lower level of income than a higher level of income among those who are poor. But we are, if you may have noticed, missing one of our 4 key properties, and that is the population principle. So that we put this sum in relation to the number of people in the country. This is the population, N. So in other words, we're dividing this amount by N for the total number of people, so that we now have an expression that also corresponds to addressing the population principle. So we'll come back to this, but this then is our P2 measure. Right, and you'll see this in the textbook as well. Proceeding, I want to talk about a few of the other measures and components of looking at how we do measure extreme poverty for some context, and then I'll wrap this up at the end. So the head count index is the most common way that poverty is measured. It is the head count, the total number of those who are poor, divided by the population. So this is the fraction of those who are poor. You can look at this right away and see that it has some problems. For example, this H is just anyone whose income is below the poverty line, YP. So that if that person's income went up, everything else constant, but that person's income was still below the poverty line, the headcount index would be unaffected. So we know this cannot be a good measure of poverty, despite the fact that it's the most commonly used measure. And in fact, it was the measure even used for the Millennium Development Goals to track progress there against poverty. So it's possible also that this even causes incentive problems. And I'll just talk about this very briefly. One reason why good measurement matters is because if you use your measure in order to chart progress, and even to evaluate how well different officials are doing as well as programs are doing, you have to realize that the kind of measure you use has incentive effects. And so when we have as our measure of extreme poverty the fraction below the poverty line, that becomes an issue. It means, for example, that there's a strong incentive for officials or others to focus on increasing the income of those whose incomes are quite close to this poverty line, YP. It's a lot easier to get the person over the poverty line. That's true even if you're just doling out the money to achieve this goal, but it's also qualitatively harder for a person to make progress if they're deeply in poverty. So we can't really prove this, but there's lots of circumstantial evidence. Incumbent politicians often frame any progress against poverty that they had in this way. The fraction of those who are poor went down, and so you can expect their staff might follow suit and anticipate this and carry out policies accordingly. Government policy, as we're going to see, especially in Chapter 7, often in developing countries, is focused on cities rather than rural areas. Although there are some poor people in cities, certainly, on average, basically in every country in the world, there might be one or two exceptions, there's greater poverty in rural areas than in urban areas. Moreover, if you look at what NGOs do, they often set up shop, for example, if not in cities, then in rural areas, but near roads. And so those are easy to get to. However, as you can imagine, people who live near roads are likely to be better off, even if poor, likely to be closer to the poverty line. For example, it's easier to get to market, just to name one kind of obvious factor. Microfinance institutions have commonly focused, according to some data, on the richest of the poor. We'll get to that later. And then again, the Millennium Development Goal, which said we were going to make progress by halving poverty. When they defined poverty as the fraction who are poor, any of these impacts might have been seen indirectly. So this matters not just for logical clarity in thinking about policies, it matters on the ground for the incentive that various people might have to carry out different kinds of programs and policies. So with that in mind, we're going to go a little bit further. We have a measure which can be thought of as, in a way, though not directly, in a way related to our basic P2 measure, the total poverty gap. And with the total poverty gap, we start in a similar way that we did in our description of P2. We start with the poverty line YP, and we subtract off the income of person I. That's the gap for this, what particular person Y how far below they are the poverty line, how far below the poverty line they are. We have H poor people, the head count. If we sum up that particular gap for everyone, we have the total poverty gap. Notice it's not quite the same because we have not normalized here. We've not divided by the poverty line for each of these individuals. Note, however, that it has some intuition in that this is the amount of money in a superficial way that you might need if you could distribute it perfectly without cost to those who are poor, to bring every single person up to the poverty line, because it sums up the amount by which those who are poor individually are finding their incomes below the poverty line. In terms of thinking about the total poverty gap, we can draw a graph of this. Here we have two cases, country A and B. In each case, just hypothetically, half the population is poor, for whatever this poverty line is. In this instance, for this graph, P is used as the poverty income. YP was what we used before. Here we have just a case in which among all of those who are poor, there was some uniform distribution. Here we have a distribution in which very commonly, more commonly, you find those whose income is further below the poverty line. If we have that, then the total poverty gap for this case will be larger. And I think that that is pretty intuitive. We can go with this another step to talk about the average poverty gap. Now, the average poverty gap is examined in relationship to the total population. That's to give it some population principle character, if you want. Sometimes this is normalized by dividing by the official poverty line. If you want to think about how poor an individual is expressed as a fraction of the poverty line, we take something we call the average income shortfall, in which we have the total poverty gap, but now we divide it by the number of people. It's the who are poor. It's the average amount by which a poor person has an income that is below the poverty line. How far, on average, is the poor person's income with respect to the poverty line? And with those components, we have the kinds of underlying ideas behind the P alpha index. And P alpha is going to include P2, which we looked at to begin with as a special case. Once again, as I was describing before, YP is our basic poverty line. For the focus principle, we need it. We subtract off the actual income of each of the individual poor people indexed by I, and then we normalize by dividing by the poverty line. Then this amount is raised to power alpha. One of the values of alpha that we have regularly cause to focus on is 2. That is to say, the square. That's what we looked at to begin with. That's what's used in this measure, P2. We then sum this up over all H poor people, and then finally, not to be forgotten, we divide by the population size so that the population principle is accounted for. So this is a general formula that's useful because it puts many, though not all, but many of the poverty measures that we commonly use in one simple framework. And usually we talk about 3 values for simplicity: alpha equals 0, 1, and 2. In principle, the value of alpha could be any non-zero, a non-negative amount rather. The UN sometimes, for various reasons, has used an alpha of 3. However, these are the most common. Now, if you think about the possibility that alpha is equal to 0, then what we have is that, of course, raised to the power of 0, this value becomes 1. So it's a 1, though, for each poor person. We sum up over all those H people, and we get the amount of H. We divide it by N, and we're back to the fraction of those who are poor. And we already saw that that's not a good measure because, among other things, it does not capture either monotonicity or distributional sensitivity. If alpha is equal to 1, that is progress, because now we are at least considering the gap between the poverty line and actual incomes of those who are poor. However, what we're not doing is taking it into account that the greater the distance between actual income and the poverty line, the worse that should be for our measure of poverty. That is to say, distributional sensitivity. If we go back to a value of 2, our P2, squaring, we're back to giving greater emphasis on deficits of income below the poverty line as those deficits get greater and greater in a nonlinear way, in this case with respect to the square. And so these are some of the basics of poverty measurement. Just a basic point to keep in mind, P2 satisfies our basic properties that we want to see in a poverty measure. If you start and work with P2, you cannot go wrong. And so on that, we will stop for this episode, and we'll then go on and consider further policy issues in poverty, inequality, and development. Thank you.